Okay, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. This is for educational purposes, and we check into great theories and concepts and discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces, theories of everything that you probably aren't familiar with. These are things that have been suppressed or otherwise difficult to access. They might be difficult mentally and or emotionally, might require some brain power or some effort on your part, or they may require a little bit of soul searching because they might attack some of your sacred cows. And this is another Bible decode. I believe this is number 418. So I'm losing count. And we've examined the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, uh, who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the Gospels as a psychological operation against the Jews. And they wanted to tame or domesticate the Jews. The Jews had risen up really nonstop for over 125 years prior to this, but then it culminated in a 7-year-long war that both Vespasian and Titus were generals in the Roman army, the commanding legions there in Judea, Jerusalem. And when they became emperors, they felt like they needed to do something to kind of mellow out the Jews, get them to get with the program, because the Jews saw themselves as chosen people and as something separate, separatists with all their rituals and all their, kosher food laws. And they were willing to die for these things. Stricture against graven images, observance of the Sabbath. And so, and they recognized that this revolt that happened in 66 AD, that started the 7-year-long war, was as a result of self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs. The prophecy for the Jewish Messiah was to be a military commander who would help deliver the Jews from their occupying power, the Romans. And so instead, the Romans created a story of a Jewish Messiah who was not a military commander but was a Prince of Peace, and who believed in rendering unto Caesar and walking the extra mile, turning the other cheek, and at the same time blasting the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers, blasting Jewish merchants for selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple, warning his followers that they needed to abandon their families in order to follow him, and yelling at the Pharisees, calling them hypocrites for merely observing the Jewish laws. And eventually, scrimping on many finer points and details of the Jewish laws and ignoring many of them entirely. And then Paul, in the epistles, is even more deferential to the Romans and even more um, critical of the Jews. So this has the fingerprints of the Romans all over it. And that's even before you recognize that the Romans were masters of psychological operations and that they had a history of creating religions for propagandistic purposes. And uh, that the Romans spoke Latin and Greek, and the Gospels are written in Greek. The Aramaic speaking uh, illiterate fishermen and publicans in Judea didn't speak Greek, and they most certainly didn't write in Greek. The Romans had full control of publishing, censorship, and distribution within their empire. Nobody was writing anything in the Roman Empire unless the Romans sanctioned it to start with. So the idea that, um, these gospels came out of uh, Palestine just already is a red flag. But then you look at the work of Josephus, and you will see that Josephus was an agent of the Roman Caesars. He was known as Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. He was adopted, but nonetheless a member, and he was also a denizen of the Caesar's palace and a member of the Roman royal court, one of the court historians. He wrote a 7-volume uh, work called War of the Jews, a history of this war. And if you read that book alongside your Gospels, the parallels, parables, satires, um, intertextual readings um, will become apparent. And it will become apparent that whoever wrote Josephus, the Romans, also wrote the Gospels. Now, when the Romans composed the Gospels, and this has been covered by a number of authors over the years, but most notably Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and also Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origin. It's a Flavian secrecy cult, but also James Valiant, Cliff Carrington, originally Abelard Reuchlin, Roman Piso, um, Henry Davis, going all the way back with Bruno Bauer and at Oxford in the early 20th century, the people that wrote for the Encyclopedia Biblica, James Ballantyne Hannay, Sir Ronald Syme. These people have all, and then to a lesser extent, Ralph Ellis and even Robert Eisenman, Achariah S. They've all endorsed aspects of this theory. So it's not really like coming out of nowhere. You could call it a conspiracy theory, but if you are a digger, you realize that conspiracy theories are basically a term that you use to discredit something that is correct. And that is what's going on here. The theory is obviously correct, but it's just that nobody has really checked into it because nobody really wants to check into it because it's going to upset their belief systems. And so that makes you less of a truther. In fact, it makes you not a truther at all if you're not willing to at least check into it. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to check into it. And if you can debunk it or prove it, uh, you know, uh, inconclusive, Tell me about it so I can hear your argument, and maybe it will convince me. I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm not bent on any particular point of view. It'd be a lot easier for me to become a Christian, but it doesn't, uh, it's not in harmony with the facts as I see them. And so I have to go with the truth as I see it. Now, when the Romans wrote the New Testament, they wrote it as a limited hangout. They put as much stuff in there as they could to make you think it was a real religion. They put a lot of stuff in there that is inspiring and, um, heartwarming, and that you can really kind of build your life around. That doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that they borrowed it from much older sources, other religions and other mythologies throughout the world, ancient Egypt, Persia, ancient India, China, Japan, Greece, Rome, and the Jews. All of them have aspects in the Gospels, as well as pagan, a ton of pagan mystery schools, uh, uh, astrology, numerology, magic, and shamanism. All of it's in there. Then, and then all of it is not original to the Gospels. It's all borrowed from much older sources. Really, the only things in the Gospels that are original are the psyop part, the mockery, the ridicule, the jokes, the satires. These are the original parts of the New Testament. Now we're looking at a book today again, written by Kersey Graves. It's called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity. And that is a story of some of these sources that the Bible draws on, that the Romans drew on in order to put together the Gospels. Now, Graves is writing back in 1876. He's not aware of the Roman origins, but he knows that whoever put together this New Testament, they were using all of these ancient sources, and that they were not, um, you know, talking about Jesus. They were talking about much older myths and religions. And we're in chapter 34, which has to do with prophecy and miracles. And we are at a section right now that is called All History Ignores Him. The fact that no history, sacred or profane, that not one of the 300 histories of that age makes the slightest allusion to Christ or any of the miraculous incidents engrafted into his life certainly proves with a cogency that no logic can overthrow, no sophistry can contradict, and no honest skepticism can resist, that there never was such a miraculously endowed being as his many Orthodox disciples claim to have been. Now, there is some corroborating evidence. There, not from any histories of that age, but Josephus mentions Jesus, Tacitus mentions Jesus, Suetonius mentions Jesus, Trajan, and also Pliny the Younger mentioned Jesus. But these are much, much later, in the late first and early second centuries, after 50 years, at least 40 years have elapsed. In some cases, nearly 100 years have elapsed since the time of the supposed time of Jesus, um, and that all of those writers are Roman royals. They are all either emperors themselves, like Trajan, or close members of the Roman royal court, like Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius. Suetonius also eventually becomes an emperor known as Antoninus Pius, at least according to Roman Piso. And Pliny as well was in tight with all of these Roman royals, these emperors. And so when you see them referring to Jesus, it's part of the psychological operation. And so, beside the Romans, none of the historians that have ever written about that age have ever mentioned anything about Jesus. Now, when you look at the Bible's account of just some of the incredible things that Jesus did, do you really think that none of it would ever appear in a history book? Now, we could say history is written by the winners, but it seems like Jesus was one of the winners. If he has this huge movement that sprouts out um, just shortly after he is crucified. Um, you would think that, and just how dominant Christianity becomes under the Roman Church, um, but not at the time. Nobody mentioned anything, not even passing. So the fact that Christ finds no place in the history of the era in which he lived, that not one event of his life is recorded by anybody but his own interested and prejudiced biographers, the Bible, the New Testament, settles the conclusion, beyond cavil or criticism, that the godlike achievements ascribed to him are naught but fable or fiction. It not only proves he was not miraculously endowed, but proves he was not even naturally endowed to such an extraordinary degree as to make him an object of general attention. I would go further and say that it actually proves that he didn't exist. I think that Kersey Graves thinks that he existed, and that he just was a minor figure, somebody who didn't really do anything. Um, Maybe not. We'll see. Let's see where he goes. It would be a historical anomaly without a precedent that Christ should have performed any of the extraordinary acts attributed to him in the Gospels, and no Roman or Grecian historian, and neither Philo nor Josephus, both writing in that age and both living almost on the spot where they are said to have been witnessed, and both, well, not really. Josephus is from a later period. Um, Josephus was born in 37 AD. So he was already, the events had already passed even by the time Josephus was born. So, anyway, no Roman or Grecian historian, and neither Philo nor Josephus, both writing in that age and both living almost on the spot where they are said to have been witnessed, and both recording minutely all the religious events of that age and country, make the slightest mention of one of them, nor their reputed authors. Now, that's not really true. He is mentioned by Josephus. Most scholars believe that that is an interpolation, and that was added onto Josephus's. It's called it's not in his work War of the Jews. It's in his later work that is called Jewish Antiquities, 20 volumes, written in the 90s, and it's sandwiched in there between two unrelated um, paragraphs. where they put in a paragraph about Jesus, and but most scholars believe it is an interpolation that like somebody stuck it in there because it is kind of a non sequitur. It doesn't look like it should be there. It doesn't flow with the rest of the text. But Joseph Atwill has shown pretty conclusively that it is supposed to be there and that it is a part of an actual satirical um, set of jokes that that Josephus put in there on purpose, specifically for a purpose. So Josephus does mention Jesus in this one paragraph. It's called the Testimonium Flavium, again named after the Flavians, the Roman Caesars. Okay, so such a historical fact banishes the last shadow of faith in their reality. It is true that a few lines are found in one of Josephus's large works alluding to Christ. Okay, this he's explaining what I just explained. It is true that a few lines are found in one of Josephus's large works alluding to Christ, but it is so manifestly a forgery that we believe all modern critics of any note, even of the Orthodox school, reject it as a base interpolation. Even Dr. Lardner, one of the ablest defenders of the Christian faith that ever wielded a pen in its support, and who has written 10 large volumes to bolster it up, assigns 9 cogent reasons for the conclusion that Josephus could not have penned those few lines found in his Jewish antiquities referring to Christ. Now, Joseph Atwill, I think, attacks that point of view, but regardless, um, it's either it's an interpolation or it's part of a psychological operation. In either case, it's not, Josephus was not attempting to tell the truth when uh, whether he wrote it or whether somebody else put it in there. It's not the truth either way. It's propaganda either way. So no Jew could possibly use such language. Um, it would be a glaring absurdity to suppose a leading Jew like Josephus, he was born a Jew, he defected to the Romans, and eventually was adopted by the Flavians. But it would be a glaring absurdity to suppose a leading Jew could call Jesus the Christ when the whole Jewish nation have ever contested the claim with the sternest logic and fought it to the bitter end. It ought, therefore, says Dr. Lardner, to be forever discarded from any place among the evidences of Christianity. Well, what are the other evidences, Dr. Lardner? Um, as the passage is not found in any edition of Josephus prior to the era of Eusebius, and I believe that, yeah, so he's getting into this, talking about Origen. It wasn't in Origen's copy, even though Origen was one of the teachers of Eusebius, or maybe not directly. Let's see. Um, Found in any edition of Josephus prior to the era of Eusebius, and that Eusebius was late third, early fourth century. The suspicion has fastened upon the Christian writer as being its author, Eusebius is saying, who argued that falsehood might be used as a medicine for the benefit of the churches. And that's, Eusebius, he's in favor of pious fraud. He calls it pious fraud. So, tell a little fib here, stretch the truth there, you know, but it's all for the purpose of the church, so it's okay. Now, Origen, who lived before Eusebius, admitted Josephus makes no allusion to Christ. Of course, the passage was not then in Josephus. Now, I have to look at Atwill's argument again, but he does address this. One or two other similar passages have been found in other authors of that era, which it is not necessary to notice here, as they are rejected by Christian writers. It must be conceded, therefore, that the numerous histories covering the epoch of the birth of Christ chronicle none of the astounding feats incorporated in his gospel biographies as signaling his earthly career, and make no mention of the reputed hero of these achievements, either by name or character. The conclusion is thus irresistibly forced upon us, not only that he was not a miracle worker, but that he must have led a rather obscure life, entirely incompatible with his being a god or a Messiah, who came to draw all men unto him. And it should also be noted here that none of Christ's famous biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, are honored with a notice in history till 190 years after the birth of Christ. And then the notice was by a Christian writer, Irenaeus. We look in vain for any contemporary notice of the Gospels or Christ, the subject of the Gospels, outside of the New Testament. So little was this King of the Jews known that the Romans were compelled to pay one of his apostles to turn traitor and act as guide before they could find him. I guess he's referring to Paul there. Oh, I guess he's referring to Judas there. Okay. Um, Now, I thought I thought it was the Jews that paid Judas. So I'm not really sure who they're referring to there. It is impossible to observe this negative testimony of all history against Christ and his miracles and not be struck with amazement and seized with the conviction that he was not a God and not a very extraordinary man. Who can believe that a God from off the throne of heaven could make his appearance on earth, and while performing the most astounding miracles ever recorded in any history, or that ever excited the credulity of any people, and be finally publicly crucified in the vicinity of a great city, and yet all the histories written in these times, both sacred and profane, pass over with entire silence the slightest notice of any of these extraordinary events. Impossible, most self evidently impossible. And when we find that this omission was so absolute that no record was made of the day or year of his birth by any person in the era in which he lived, and that they were finally forgotten, and hence that there are, as a writer informs us, no less than 133 different opinions about the matter, the question assumes a still more serious aspect. From the logical potency of these facts, we are driven to the conclusion that Christ received but little attention outside of the circle of his own credulous and interested followers, and consequently stands on a level with Krishna of India, Mithra of Persia, Osiris of Egypt, and other demigods of antiquity, all whose miraculous legends were ingrafted in their histories long after their death. This leads us to consider how Christ's incredible legends got into history. Now, I think we're going to save this for tomorrow. Um, no, it's short enough. I think we'll try to trudge through this here. Okay, so how Christ's incredible legends got into history. There is a remarkably easy and satisfactory way to accounting for all the marvelous feats and incredible stories found in the gospel narratives of Jesus Christ without assuming their reality or any intentional fraud or falsehood by the writers. When we learn that none of his evangelical biographies were penned till long after his death, we are no longer puzzled for a moment to understand exactly how many statements, wholly incredible and morally impossible, crept into his history without challenging or calling in question the veracity or honesty of the writer. Perhaps the most powerful cord of moral conviction which holds the Christian professor to a belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ is the difficulty of bringing himself to believe that the numerous miracles ascribed to him in the Gospels are merely the work of fiction, fabricated without a basis of truth, when they were evidently penned by men of the deepest piety and the strictest moral integrity. We ourselves were once environed with this difficulty, but it stands in our way no longer. We are disenthralled. We have solved the problem. We have found the true explanation. The key and clue to the whole secret is found in the simple fact, admitted by Christian writers and evidenced by the Bible itself, that no history of Christ's practical life was written out by a person claiming to have been an eyewitness of the events reported, nor until every incident and act of the noble minded Nazarene had had ample time to become enormously magnified and distorted by rumor, fable, and fiction, so that it was impossible to discriminate or separate the real from the unreal, the true from the false in his partly forgotten life. It could not be done. A true history could not then be, nor have been written under such circumstances. It is manifestly impossible. The time for writing each gospel is fixed by Dr. Lardner as follows. And Dr. Lardner says that Matthew was written in 62 AD, Mark in 64 AD, Luke 63 or 4 AD, and John in 68 AD. Those figures have been revised uh, a lot by scholars, and I think that all of them then would have been written after 66 AD, when the war between the Romans and the Jews started, in that some of these Gospels refer to events that occurred in that war, at least according to Josephus. But even so, we're still back at 62 AD at the earliest. That's almost 30 years after the events. Um, that's best case scenario, and that's for the earliest one. Now, most scholars, I believe, now think that the Gospels were written between late 60s and about 100 AD for John. Now, you occasionally see somebody that says that John was written much earlier. Um, be that as it may, continuing on, thus allowing ample time for every noteworthy incident of his life to grow from molehills to mountains and to swell into fiction, fable, and prodigy, a tendency to which was then very rife and very prevalent in all religious countries. Now, historians today, Christian apologists, they think that it takes literally generations in order to swell fiction into fable. that it takes like 150 years to do that. And that's so, with it, it's only 30, 40, 50 years later. Oh, that's completely fine. Well, just think, you know, um, I've been hearing, for my whole life about how, everybody was at Wilt Chamberlain's game where he scored 100 points in 1961. You know, that didn't take very long for it to turn into a fable. I mean, it really happened, I believe, but the fact that everybody was there um, didn't happen. And that's just a crude example, but I believe that it doesn't really take very much time to swell fiction into fable. Um, and this not even including psychological operation, in which case fiction turns into fable, um, or it's not really fact turns into fiction, into fable. Um, but if you're doing a psyop, then you don't even have a fact to start with. You're just making the whole thing up, and borrowing other sources. So um, this is just this is really Christians painted into a corner here. There just isn't any evidence, and so you can rely on faith, but if you rely on faith, then you cannot call yourself a truther. Um, Having made a note of this fact, let the reader treasure in memory, as another equally important fact, that the biography of no man of note who figured in that era or who lived prior to the dawn of letters is free from a large percentage of extravagant detail and simple incidents magnified into miracles. This was the uncurbed tendency of the age which ultimated into universal custom. The simplest incident in every man's life who exhibited mind enough to attract attention by rolling from year to year and passing from mouth to mouth invariably got to be finally swelled into such undue and enormous proportions that it could only be accounted for by assuming the actor to have been a god. In this way, many men of different countries who had made a mark in the world received divine honors and divine attributes, including such characters as Krishna of India, Mithra of Persia, Quirinus of Rome, Eris of the Druids, Quetzalcoatl of Mexico, Jesus Christ of Judea, and many others who might be mentioned. This circumstance deified them. The evidence of history prove this declaration is abundant and irresistible. All right, that's into that section. Tomorrow we'll start out with the next section, which is called Posthumous Histories Alone Deified Men. And we'll get into that then. For now, we're going to stop. And thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and contribute. And we'll see you next time. Come back for a new Bible Decode. Have a great night.